science of glute training. So let's go ahead and just start from the beginning, right? So the first thing that we're going to go through 4 infographics. Now the cool thing about the glutes is that they're really complex, right? And I think everyone would agree with that. Because of that, we're actually going to do 4 infographics, 4 lessons this month, and then next month we're actually going to do a whole nother lesson on glutes, right? So I got to go ahead, I got to give a shout out to my boy Dr. Brett Contreras. Now I actually met up with him in Norway last month. So if you're going to see this later, Brett, what's up? He's the glute master. But we're going to go ahead, we're going to go through 4 different infographics. So starting with the anatomy. If you look at the glutes, they're, again, a massive, massive muscle, and I think a lot of people neglect them. You know, we think about them, yeah, from an aesthetic standpoint. If you look at figure competitors, if you look at bikini competitors, glutes win shows. But obviously, an aesthetic standpoint, they're very important. But also, we can think of them from a functional standpoint. They're huge for sport performance, right? So they're really, really important for sport performance overall, right? So if you look, the muscle, the gluteus maximus, it originates like all along the spine. It even has connections with the lats itself, and it connects, you know, around it actually inserts, meaning the part that's going to actually move on the upper thigh, on an area called the greater trochanter. So that's kind of like on the outer part of the upper thigh, and this is really, really important because when you're thinking about what's the function of the glutes, what does it do? Well, if it's originating along the spine, along the lats, the hips, and it's inserting on the upper thigh, on the greater trochanter, what's it going to do? Well, the glutes, several scientists have looked at it, but there's like 2 components to it at least. Some people say way more, but in general, you can divide the glutes into the upper glutes, which is at about 40%, and then the lower glutes, which is about 60% of the muscle. So the upper glutes, they're going to be more like hip adduction. So when we talk about adduction, we're talking about taking your leg and moving it out to the side. That's the upper glute. So it's taking the leg and moving it out to the side. Or if you're thinking like turning your toes outward, turning your toes outward like on a squat, that's going to be more of abduction, external rotation. So the upper glutes is going to be external rotation, which, think of this as my feet, turning them outward on a squat. So here's my feet externally rotating outward. That's going to be the upper glutes. And then moving my arms, my legs outward like this, that's also going to be the upper glutes. But if I'm talking about like my lower glutes, they have a better mechanical advantage to extending the hip. So that's me taking my leg and moving it straight back. So if we kind of look at what those exercises are going to be, if you're talking about like banded, kind of say you put bands on and you're kind of squatting and walking sideways, is more going to be the upper glutes, right? If you're doing abduction like the abductor machine, that's going to be the upper glutes. If you're gonna go extension like you're doing cable kickbacks, triple extensions, glute bridges, that's the lower glutes. So that's really important to understand on that. So that's some major actions: extension, lower glutes, external rotation, pointing your toes out on squats or on the leg press, and then also going on to the hip extension, which is going to be like the lower glute, 60% of the muscle. So that was the first infographic. But the other thing on the first infographic, when you're looking at the anatomy of any muscle, you want to know its function, right? So there are a couple things like, should I train the glutes fast? Should I train them for high force? You know, what should I do? Well, a couple things. When you look at muscle fibers, the longer they are, the better they are at high velocity contractions. Turns out that the glutes have very long muscle fibers. So one of the things that you could do with them is essentially things that are more rapid contractions, which are going to be like Aaron Stern, who came in earlier today, really likes plyometrics. And so the glutes are going to be good at things like explosive movements, like plyometrics, jumping, bounding movement, could activate because they're a long fiber. Sprinting is going to be good for the glutes because they can operate fast. But the crazy thing about the glutes is they're also built for force. So there's a thing on the glutes, there's a thing on any muscle that's called the pennation angle of the muscle fiber. So you have the tendon, and the angle is where the muscle fibers, how angled are they relative to the tendon. The glutes have a large pennation angle, and the greater the angle that you have, the more force it can produce. So this tells us that not only are glutes important for high fast velocity contractions, but they actually can produce high force contractions. So someone asked me today, is doing like heavy movement for glutes good? Yes. They're actually mechanically built for both high force and high velocity contractions. So that's important to understand. Now, moving on to infographic 2, or the lesson 2 that we talked about muscle fiber makeup. You'll see a lot of differences in some of the studies on muscle fiber makeup, but for young individuals, basically what you're going to end up seeing is that 50% of the glutes are made up of slow twitch fibers, 50% of the glutes are made up of fast twitch muscle fibers. So what's the significance of that? Slow twitch muscle fibers are more for like high rep activity, very high rep activity, short rest period lengths, giant sets, supersets. We were talking about 15 repetitions, 20 repetitions, all those things like that. That's going to be like for the slow twitch population. Fast twitch muscle fibers are again going to be very explosive movements and heavier lifting, more like 6 to 8 heavy repetitions. So what does this mean? 50% of the time when you're training glutes, go for more higher reps, anywhere from 12, 15, 20 reps, short rest period lengths. 50% of the time, we'd recommend training them more heavy. And that's going to be more, for bodybuilding purposes, probably anywhere from 8 to 12 repetitions. If you're really going to get heavy, 6 to 8 repetitions is going to be good for the glutes. So that was the second infographic we talked about. The third study is really, really interesting, because think about all the variations that we have in exercise. What's best for glutes? Is it lunges? Is it squats? Is it triple extensions? Is it glute bridges? You have to understand how the glutes are activated, right? When they're activated to the greatest extent. So it turns out that, think about this for a second, okay? The glutes are activated to the greatest extent when their fibers are more shortened, and they're activated to the greatest extent when you're actually doing your near full extension, okay? So think about it. When am I near full extension? When I stand up and my legs are straight and my back is upright, I'm near full extension, okay? Or I'm at full extension. So glutes are activated to the greatest degree when I'm at full extension, and that's important to understand. So if I squat, like right now I'm seated, right? So my hips are flexed to a larger degree when I'm seated, like 90-degree hip flexion right now. If I were to stand up, now I'm getting into my hips actually being extended. I have to extend my hips to stand up. Okay, makes sense? So remember, the glutes are activated greatest in full extension. Now let's take that to analyze the squat, for example, okay? It's my favorite exercise, probably done more squats than any exercise ever in my life. But if you think about squats, when are squats hardest? Are they hardest when you're near the top, or are they harder when you're at the bottom of the movement, right? What do you guys think? Squats, are they harder at the bottom in the hole, or are they harder at the top? Well, the best way to answer that is think about when you go to the gym. When you go to the gym, 90% of the time I see guys load up the bar with like 4 plates. They squat down a quarter of the way and then they come up, right? And why? Because it's easier to do half squats than full squats. If they were to go all the way to the floor, they'd fail. My point is that squats are hardest when you're in hip flexion, not near full extension. So by nature, squats are not going to be the best exercise for glutes. Just the way it is. But there are things that you can work around that. And next month I'll talk about how do you take the squat and make it more specific for glutes. But I'm letting you know you have to do things with squats to make it a better exercise for glutes. So things so if you're looking, again, if you're looking at more like cable extensions, or if you're looking at things that are going to be like glute bridges, or if you're looking at hyperextensions are hardest near the top of the movement. Well, your glutes are firing the most basically when you're near full extension. So the hyperextensions are going to activate the glutes much more than squats. Reverse hyperextensions are going to activate the glutes much more than squats. So if you're just doing squats and you're wondering why you don't have good glutes, that's why. So anything, again, things that are hardest near full extension. Now, how can we overcome that? You can add bands to the exercise. So if I add bands to squats, when I come near the top of the movement, the bands are getting harder. Remember 2 weeks ago we talked about accommodating resistance? When I come to the top, it's harder, so now the squat becomes more of a glute exercise. Speaking of that, in going with Brett Contreras, the last study that we talked about was when Brett Contreras did a study, and this was his dissertation. He compared glute bridges to, and this we'll talk about on tomorrow's Muscle PhD Academy, but he compared glute bridges to squats. And you know what he found? You know, if you look at the infographic, look up Brett Contreras, you'll know what glute bridges are. But anyway, he found that's where you take a barbell, you put it over your hip, and you're laying back on a bench, and then you're basically just like bridging up. You're bridging upward. So anyway, he found that glute bridges activated the glutes really high. I mean, the upper and the lower glutes really high. But he also found that squats barely activated them at all. So when you're working out, like say 70% of your 1RM on glute bridges, 90% glute activation of the upper glutes, 60%, 70% glute activation of the lower glutes. When he actually did squats, he was like 30-40% muscle activation. So again, by nature, as much as I love squats, but guess what was activated a lot in squats? The quads. So you're going to get large quads when you do squats. That's why probably like my quads are overdeveloped, So I have to do a lot more concentration on hip extensors. So let's summarize this all up. The glutes, right? They originate on the spine. And the lats, hips, they insert on the upper thigh. The upper glutes are going to be more for like hip, basically hip abduction, so you're moving your leg outward. External rotation, so if you're doing squats, you point your toes out, you'll get more activation. If you're doing like leg press, you point your toes out, you'll get more activation because that's external rotation. The lower glutes are going to be more like hip extension, and that's going to be more like banded, hip extension type movements. And it's also going to be glute bridges, triple extensions. The next thing we talked about, muscle fiber makeup, 50% slow. That's going to be higher repetitions, 12 to 15 reps, maybe 20 repetitions, 30-second rest periods. Remember, you're going to recover faster from those, so you actually could probably train more frequently when you're hitting the slow twitch muscle fibers. Fast twitch muscle fibers, heavier loads. So we're talking maybe even explosive movements. Explosive movements like Aaron Stern does plyometrics. And then you're going to work in more of a 6 to 8 rep range, no more than like 5 repetitions. When we're actually talking about what's the best exercises for the glutes, it's not going to be squats, because as much as I love squats, basically the exercise is hardest when you have hip flexion and easiest when you're doing hip extension. But you want the exercise to be hardest on hip extension, and that's going to be more like glute bridges, triple extensions, hyper extensions, reverse hyper extensions. And I think that covers it. So now we're going to go ahead and just have you guys ask questions.
You have any questions up there you want to ask her first?
Yeah, Tim Greslick goes, so bands pulling at hips at the top of the squat? Yes, Tim, that's going to be because you want the activity to be harder on the top. So same thing with leg press, you know. Let's see, Giorgio asks, hey doc, can glutes grow with only isolation exercises? Band, RDL, hip thrust, cable, kickback, adductor machine without squat, step up, lunges, leg press? Thank you. Great question. Actually, isolation movements activate the glutes more than things like lunges. The thing to understand, what the advantage that lunges give you is, remember, one of the mechanisms of muscle growth is muscle damage. So even though you won't get as much glute activation when you do lunges compared to isolation movements, you're going to get more muscle damage with lunges. That's why I recommend them. So you don't get as much activation, but you get more muscle damage. That's why you're sore next day, and that is important for growth. So Erica, hey Erica, says, would you say starting your workout with heavy lifts, moving to lighter lifts toward the end to target both types of muscle fibers would be beneficial for overall glute hypertrophy? We actually just did we have a pilot work. We did a guy, John George's, in our laboratory, compared doing heavy and light lifting in the same workout. He actually found that it actually did produce a really great effect. The other thing, so yes, Erica, that would work. The other thing I'm going to say is this on that. If you think about it, there's a concept called post-activation potentiation. When you lift heavier, you can actually lift more in a lighter repetition range after. So it's called post-activation potentiation. Whereas if you warmed up with like really high endurance work, it actually would hurt heavier lifting. So you're absolutely on point. Carissa says, what's the best growth exercise for upper glute area? The answer is going to be anything that's abduction related. So like, for example, if you're doing banded side lateral knee, basically knee movement, so you put bands around your knees, actually it's probably going to be better around your ankles, and you're walking laterally bent, that's going to be great for the upper glutes. So that would say that's going to be close to run. Adductor machine is going to be great for the upper glutes. Cable adductor movements is going to be great for the upper glutes. Okay, what do you think of circumduction movements? It's like when you're moving around like that. Circumduction movements, you're going to get a lot of external rotation, and you're going to get abduction. So I think that's going to be good for the upper glutes. Again, so that was Daphne. You're welcome, Erica. Okay, what other questions we got? Someone says something about how often should you train glutes per week for optimum growth? The answer to that is you got to periodize it. So I would recommend, if you're doing basically high volume, so if you're doing like 24 sets to 30 sets for glutes twice a week, but if you're hitting glutes a little bit every day, like 10 sets a day, you might be able to train them 5 days a week. The key is, if you're doing that, probably limit your heavy days to no more than 1 to 2 days, and like lunges probably no more than 1 to 2 days, so you get a lot of damage. If you're doing a lot of banded work and a lot of extension work, near full extension, you could train the glutes more frequently. It's the long range of movements, like you can almost do that every day. It's the long range of movement stuff, like lunges, that cause the most muscle damage that you need the most recovery from. So basically you're limiting the heavy days, and you're limiting like the lunge days to 1 to 2 days a week. Otherwise, you can almost train glutes like every day, to be quite honest. Why band around the ankles versus above the knees? Cody asked this question. Basically, what's going on is that just mechanically speaking, when the weight's around the knees, it's applying a greater force to the glutes than if it was higher up on the knees. Basically, you're kind of creating a greater mechanical advantage for the bands mechanically around the ankles than if you were to actually do them up on the knees. So in this case, that's going to be, Cody, that's going to be good for that. should men train with other rep ranges than women? I think Benny asked that. I think that women and men should train similar ranges. One thing I'll say is this. Studies show that women are more fatigue resistant than men, all right? So you think about it like this. Like, let's say like Andy and I are going to go squat, or like, Paul and I, we're going to go squat, right? So it's typical. We're going to go in there and do like 5 sets of heavy squats. We're going to yell at each other. We're going to pump each other up. 1 more rep, right? But then what? Maybe we do some heavy, whatever, deadlifts after that. And we're cool. Great job, man. Fist pump. Women, like if you go to the gym, they do like 5 different variations of squat, 4 different variations of lunges, like, banded, stuff. And basically, if you took a normal guy and put him through like a normal girl's workout, they would die, right? And why is that? There's lots of studies that show that women are far more fatigue resistant than men. And literally, they're more. It's just the way it is. There's tons of studies that even with equal training status, women are more fatigue resistant than men. So oftentimes they can handle higher volumes than men. So men almost have to work their way up to be able to hang with women on high volume stuff. It's the way it is. So that might be the only reason why you're seeing differences in that. It's just the way it is, man.
You made it.
It's science. Let's see. Someone goes, what are the best exercises for people who have weak knees or had a past surgery? I do lightweight, and I would do blood flow restriction. Okay. What do you guys? These questions are coming in.
I know they're coming quick.
Yeah. Okay. Are chains as effective as bands for accommodating resistance in the squat? You know what? I would say, yeah. Jonathan, my advice is this. On heavier days, like if you're trying to target those fast twitch fibers, I prefer chains. On more of the lighter, higher rep days, I prefer bands. Of course, bands are more versatile for other things, but that's what I would recommend. Someone goes, let's see. I usually split my workouts from quads and glutes on 2 different days. Would you say that in order to gain size in both quads and glutes, isolating and putting the muscle under muscle tension is better? That's Karen. Karen, the answer is you're doing the right thing. Yes. And in fact, there's studies which basically show, like, they'll look at the hip, they'll look at hip extension, which is where you activate the glutes, and at the same time, they'll keep the same load on extension, but they'll have the muscle work at the knees at the same time. So you're doing like knee flexion and extension. Even if you have the same load on the hip extensors, you lower the muscle activation of the glutes. What that tells me is that having a glute day or like a glute hamstring day is probably going to be better than if you're like just trying to hit them both at once. So don't get me wrong, I mean, you're going to, by nature, with a lot of compound movements, hit them at once. But having an isolation day is going to be definitely beneficial. You know, I like this because like these are all training questions.
They're all applied to the
They're all training questions. Like I'm always getting nutrition questions, but this is really cool. I'm going to take what, 2 or 3 more?
Yeah.
Okay. You guys are freaking awesome. Okay. Let's see. What would you say is the best glute exercise for someone with a weak lower back? Hyperextensions are going to be good. Hyperextensions, reverse hyperextensions are going to be good. Abduction / external rotation during sumo deadlifts help activate the glutes more as well. External rotation seems to help activate the glutes more, yes. There's not that much of a difference between sumos and traditional deadlifts as far as glute activation, but you know, I think the main thing is whatever stance you can utilize to get a better mind-muscle connection would be beneficial. Good question, Brandon. Any other questions we got?
I have one more.
One more question? What you got?
Proceed. That question doesn't make sense.
No? Okay. Someone goes, squat versus deadlift max weight ratios. Does this affect how you should train in order to bring up one or the other? Did you have you get thoughts on that?
I have thoughts.
Okay, jump in. So I'm gonna let Will take this. Squats versus deadlift max ratios. Does this affect how you should train in order to bring up one or the other?
You had to roll your chair. You couldn't walk.
This is Will. Will's our biomechanist and neurophys mechanics.
Everything
Go.
that nobody else wants to do.
Okay, well, if we're talking about ratios, deadlift to squat, Andy was actually asking me about that earlier. Honestly, and that's going to depend if you're looking for hypertrophy or strength, but if we're just looking for the ratio of the load itself, well, again, you have to look at what does a squat look like. It's a counter movement, so look at the total distance you cover going from eccentric to concentric. That's literally twice the distance you cover when you go from a deadlift, which is really just a concentric movement. So the distance covered is really half that for a deadlift than it is in a squat. So theoretically, you'd be able to deadlift more. At the same time, you're not able to use like muscle spindles from a stretch shortening cycle on a deadlift because you start out at the very bottom. So honestly, that really depends if you want to train more your nervous system to use those passive forces like muscle spindles or elastic forces from tendons, or if you want to work on your rate of force development for a deadlift and being able to develop force as fast as possible in a very short amount of time with very low displacement of the actual bar path. Also, the more you actually flex the hips backwards, the more you're going to engage the hips and engage the glutes. So when you go down into a squat, it depends. Like if you low bar squat, then your glutes are going to be much more engaged. It's this guy. He's a low bar squatter. And because I'm tall, I have to low bar squat if I want to lift. If I want to lift a load, it's not going to make me look like I'm 12 years old lifting in the gym. So same. So when you deadlift, typically your hips are flexed farther backwards, and because of that, you have more glute activation than quad activation, and your glutes and your hips can handle a lot more load than quads. So.
Thanks, buddy.
Hope that answers it.
Hashtag science, guys. Hashtag mechanics applied applied to hypertrophy. So, all right. So basically, someone goes to deficit RDL, good for lower glutes. Remember, glutes are going to be activated more in hip extension, so that's not necessarily going to help that much.